movement in your life, one of the most profoundly powerful interventions to stay healthy. But how do you do it? Hi, this is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And today we have a guest that we've interviewed 5 years ago, Dr. Joan Vernikos, who is a true pioneer and really one of the first professionals to understand the value and the importance of regular movement in preventing disease. I mean, it's become quite popular now. Sitting as the new smoking is a real popular meme. It's been around for a while and people understand it. This is not new information, but she was one of the leaders and she has a lot of interesting information and details on why it's so important and should we trust her? Well, she has a Ph.D. She was hired by NASA in 1964, 5 years before Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. And she's written over 200 scientific papers. She was the director of the life sciences at NASA from 93 until 2000. And she's just did enormous loads of information. And she hasn't been with NASA for a while now. So she's had this time to reflect because a big part of her position was administrative. So she had a time to reflect and think on everything that was going on and has come up with some really interesting theories. And she's written a book and put some of them in there. It's called Design to Move, which is an update from her previous book, which I believe is Sitting Kills. Welcome and thank you for joining us today, Dr. Vernikos.
Thank you very much for having me on again for a sequel.
Yes, for an update, because it is such an important strategy for optimizing your health. And, I'm just going to give a little personal history before we go into the details and expand it. Because when I last interviewed with you, I've had a significant amount of incapacitating back pain. And I had implemented your recommendations of sitting up or standing up a few times an hour and doing some exercises in that, but that wasn't sufficient to relieve the back pain. For me, I had to stand up completely. And as I'm doing this interview, I'm standing up and have been for pretty much the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm not sure that it has the specific health benefits of standing versus sitting, but for me, it was a postural thing and it just had an influence on my muscles. But once I started standing up, the back pain disappeared. And you have a different perspective on that because of this change in position that's so crucial. But we'll get into that in a bit. And now I believe you dedicated this book to John Glenn. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, and of course he was the first astronaut that did an orbital flight from the United States. Obviously the Russians did that previously. And he was a senator and he died actually late last year in December 2016. Correct. But he returned to space at the age of 77. So, and I believe he was the oldest astronaut. So yes. Why don't you tell us a little about your relationship with Senator John Glenn?
Well, I was instrumental in, I think, in helping him getting back into space, because when he first came up with this suggestion, everyone thought, oh, well, can't send an old man up in space. What if something happens to him? Then how do we explain it?
Sure.
And
it's a risk.
It's a risk. And the oldest person at that point was 52, Musgrave, who is not a spring chicken exactly, but 52. And so Glenn wanted to fly again because John F. Kennedy had prevented him from going to the moon because he was a national hero and it wouldn't be politically pleasant if something happened to him. So he was forbidden from flying again. He tried to be a politician, almost president. And then as senator, he arrived at NASA and my administrator said, well, John, what do you think? Should we let John fly again? Which was a heck of a question. And I said, arbitrarily, why not? But, let's do some homework with the National Institute on Aging. And we started asking around questions of experts, and the answer came back, well, there is no reason to exclude him as long as he is healthy and fit. Okay, so of course, lots of tests, and he continued to be a senator right up to the day he flew. He was doing all his homework for the shuttle flight, on his flights back and forth. And he was extraordinary. My concern was not that anything would happen to him during the flight, but how would he recover, or would he recover?
How long was he up there for?
He's only 9 days.
Okay.
Only, yeah.
It was longer than his first flight.
Longer, that's for sure. And that was my big worry. And he came back, of course, walked off like everybody else. And we had a session at the National Institute of Health on the results, which were all double-blind, and revealed that evening. And this chart was put up with all the clustered data and one outlier. And I thought, well, of course, that's got to be John Glenn, who is different from all the others who were in their 30s. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, well, it was a good try. And it turned out that John Glenn was among the cluster, and the one outlier was 35 years old. So that message came across loud and clear. And of course, he recovered very fast. And I escorted him on many rounds we did to explain to people what had happened, what we'd learned. And the message came back loud and clear. If you are healthy and you are fit and you take care of yourself, which is a very important premise, there's no reason you can't do anything that anyone else can do. And that was his belief, right up to the day he died.
How old is he when he passed?
95.
Wow, that's pretty good. So that was interesting because it provided us with some lessons about microgravity. And you were, when he was up there, you were still at NASA, right?
Oh yes, I was still director of life science.
All right, you're the director there. So, and your concern, well, I guess the concern is, I mean, obviously it's a lot more than a few hours and 9 days, but there are people up there, been up there for over a year now, and there are definitely some downsides. So interestingly, I don't know if I shared this in the last one, but one of like many kids, I remember clearly watching Armstrong land on the moon and was inspired, and I wanted to be an astronaut and really pursued it until late high school. I was committed to following a path to lead me to be an astronaut. But then I had some encounters with the government and realized I do not want to do anything with the United States government. So I'm out of here. And I'm so glad I did, because I later learned some of the dangers, like the ionizing radiation and gamma rays, and of course the lack of gravity, which is you're a specialist in. So why don't you start expanding on some of the concerns you have, because this was really why you're one of the pioneers in this area, because this lack of gravity is very similar to inactivity down on Earth, where we have gravity.
It is very similar to inactivity on Earth, but that's not the only feature of removing gravity, of getting away from gravity, and the consequences or the acknowledgement, let's say, of the participants in the program, that there's something possibly wrong with the right stuff, which is the astronauts' favorite
the movie,
the scripter. How could anything happen to them that is not very pleasant? Well, it does, and we can't deny it anymore. And we cannot deny not only that what is has been now shown, that changes occur in space, in the microgravity of space, that are very reminiscent of those of aging on Earth, except they happen 10 times faster. So if you're going to lose bone at 1% a year here on Earth, as from age 20 on, you're losing 5%, sometimes more, sometimes less, in space per month. So that
adds up real quickly.
In 6 months periods that they were going, one astronaut lost 30% of his bone. Now that's a lot of bone to lose.
And I'm sure they were on a pretty aggressive exercise program. I don't think any astronaut isn't exercising hours every day.
Absolutely. Up to 4 hours a day, 2 hours to 4 hours a day of exercise. with a couple of exceptions that I need to point to you, because it's right down your way of thinking, I think.
All right.
And it's obviously the exercise is complicated in space, more complicated in space than it is on Earth, because you have to wear bungee cords to hold you down on any treadmill. Your resistive exercise is much more complicated because there isn't gravity to work against, and all kinds of things like that. But in spite of all that, the changes we see keep appearing and being faster than they are on Earth. And
despite the attempts to remediate it with exercise.
If you stop and think about it, we have never flown an astronaut without exercise. So what we're seeing with the exercise, okay, this is what worries me. This is what worries me, because we kind of forget. We say, well, exercise helps you. I'm sure it helps. I have no doubt that it helps.
But there's no control that hasn't went up without exercise.
No control, and we're getting a heck of a lot of adverse effects, as it is with that exercise. Now, I have a theory about that, because I have a theory about most things, that the minute you stop exercising in space, you're right back in microgravity. You're not back to 1G as you are on Earth. There is
excuse me for a moment for interrupting, but your microgravity is, you've known it for decades, but for those who don't, maybe if you can define that. It's the lack of gravity, or relative, but specifically.
Yeah. It's well below the threshold of what we perceive as gravity.
Okay.
It's 10 to the minus 5, if you want to be.
Okay, yeah, that's what it was. I knew it was very small. It was 100,000th or a millionth of the.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And so when you exercise on Earth, you have gravity to work against, and the minute you stop, the response does not just cut off. The response continues over a period of time, which is a very interesting phenomenon. This is the after response to exercise. Very valuable. In space, there's no after response, because there is no gravity to recover in. And so it's whammo, you're right back down at 10 to the minus 5G. And I know the body responds to, when it first responds to microgravity, to low gravity, you see a sequence of changes. And just as you see the same sequence in reverse when you stand up or when you return from flight. So the response to gravity produces a sequence of changes. The response to microgravity, or almost no gravity, is a mirror image of your response to standing or your response to being launched.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So that is absent. The after response is absent in microgravity. And so I think we might be able to get exercise to work in space if we distributed it throughout the day in intermittent periods.
Yes, that is, to me, after reading your new book, it seemed the summary, if I could put into a few words, is intermittent, low intensity, high frequency. In other words, move your butt all day long unless you're sleeping.
Exactly. And that's what we're designed, that's the way we've been designed. Because when you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes because of light, not because of gravity, and I'm sure there's an interaction there between light and gravity. So you open your eyes, and what do you do first thing?
Stand
it's
up.
Amazing what audiences tell me, but that's beside the point. What you do is get up.
Yeah.
You stand up, and then you go about your business, whatever that happens to be. And during the day, you are moving. They're designed to move all day long until it's night again, and you go back to bed to sleep. It's a very neat system.
Yes, indeed.
And what we've done is we've modified it.
Oh, radically modified. I think modified is too kind a term.
Well, we've yeah, we've cut it, whatever off. We modified it. And well, not only that, but in addition, any of our defense mechanisms, any brain mechanism, any neural mechanisms that gravity keeps tuning all day long with movement are not there. We have this barrage of texting and technological input that is bombarding our system.
Sure.
And we need this underlying movement all day long to tune us, to prime us, to be able to respond to the onslaught of whatever it is, whether it is running to get away from the tiger, or climbing the tree, or to defend ourselves against whatever stress, onslaught, electronics, you name it.
So this information is not radical or new, or, you know, most everyone's going to be aware of this, that you need to move. But what I want you to share and go into greater depth on is your appreciation of the influence of microgravity on the vestibular system, and then how that influences health, and what you learn from that, and what we can transfer to what we have on Earth.
It is very fascinating. One of our missions, Rick Searfoss, an astronaut who was pilot on that mission and became commander of the shuttle, was being tested on something called the standing plate, what's it called? The balance. Mm-hmm. His balance was being tested, and he's standing on this moving plate while we're all sort of chit-chatting around. And I suddenly see him leaning forward very gradually and just keep going. Mm-hmm. And this is after his 9-day flight in space. And I rushed to catch him. Of course, there would have been no way I could have caught him coming down as dead weight. And more of us fortunately came. We grabbed him, and he shook his head and he said, "What happened?" And I said, as he opened his eyes, I said, "You were about to fall flat on your face." He said, "I never felt as if I was falling. I never felt the need to put my arms out to protect myself." Now, after 9 days, that is highly significant, because what it means is that the brain maps of where we are relative to our environment had disappeared. As a child, as we develop, as we somersault, as we jump, as we whatever, do all these wondrous things we do as children, we develop maps in our brain that tell us where we are relative to our environment. We can shut our eyes and touch our nose, for instance, among other things. In space, this relationship is not there. There are no cues from gravity for up and down, for acceleration, for sense of direction, and we are floating around in the spacecraft, or we appear to be floating, weightless, and don't need them until we get back. And what we didn't know, I mean, we knew that neuroplasticity had not too many years before been discovered and acknowledged, but we did not know whether we could reproduce these maps that we developed as children. And of course, he went through a rehab, which was more or less the same as all other times that astronauts flew. And sure enough, he reacquired these maps, these brain maps that tell us what his relationship to the new environment of coming back on Earth was. So we know that you can recover from that sort of. So if you're 80 years old and you have poor balance, and someone tells you, "Well, would you expect you're 80 years old?" The answer is, hell no. There is absolutely no reason that you cannot reacquire these maps and the orientation that you had as a child with your environment.
And the vestibular system is actually far more, has more features or functions than just balance. And the vestibular system is the inner ear, of course. And why don't you discuss some of the other ones like blood pressure regulation and muscle?
Yes, it is a lot of research has been done in the vestibular system thanks to NASA. And it is now clear that certainly blood pressure regulation is very much a function of regulated by the vestibular system, but also bone loss and muscle atrophy can also be related to a functioning vestibular system. So these are just three critical features and responses that we know happen when you reduce the gravity stimulus that we're exposed to all day long. The blood pressure, of course, was one of the first things we saw in returning astronauts, the sudden drop in blood pressure on standing up, and orthostatic hypotension, as it's technically called. And that is a very important indicator of the rest of the function of the cardiovascular system and its relationship to the vestibular system. Because another thing that happens that is not so visible as fainting when you stand up is that the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessels, virtually disappears. I mean, we've flown rats, and whom you can take the veins out and the blood and the arteries, and they're translucent.
Now, it was my understanding that the endothelium is where large amounts of nitric oxide are stored.
Yes.
So that would seem that's a really important.
It's a really important
biomodulator. So, I mean, is that correct? And did you notice?
That is correct. And we haven't even scratched the surface on that possible side effect, because, you know, until we see a very obviously adverse effect, not much research is done in the area, unfortunately.
Wow. I had no idea that the endothelium was decimated.
So if you look at elderly and you look at sedentary and you look at space, it is a continuum. The changes are very much a continuum of reduced exposure to gravity, or yes, reduced exposure to gravity or exposure to reduced gravity, both.
Now, I listened to your interview on STEM Talk, and you offered a hypothesis there on the vestibular system, which I thought was intriguing, because it's your belief that the best stimulus to the vestibular system is postural change. So can you expand on that?
Yes, it's the most basic stimulus that we experience many times a day, or we should. And and we it involves the signal is perceived by the vestibular system, which then regulates blood pressure. So as you stand up, it would if you've been exposed to space, or if you've been sitting too long, or if you've been bedridden for a reason or not, you will have the tendency to faint. You'll have that low blood pressure, a sudden drop in blood pressure. Or 5 days with the flu in bed, and you get up after having been in bed for 4 or 5 days.
Do you know what the mechanism for the inability to control the blood pressure is? It related to nitric oxide in any way, or is it another mechanism?
A lot of it is dehydration, but it's not the whole story. Some people are more prone to orthostatic hypotension than others, so there's a sympathetic nervous system, a norepinephrine involvement. People will have a higher blood pressure normally and a higher sympathetic nervous system, more sensitive sympathetic nervous system, are less likely to faint on standing up after being deprived, and so on. They all get there eventually. It's a time course thing. Some are better off for a while, but eventually they all, and so I think there's a third component that is very much, there's also an angiotensin component, the enzyme that converts renin to angiotensin, which is found in the lung, is suppressed in flight, and I have no doubt that nitric oxide is very much a participant. But
so I think now that you've elaborated on the connections to the vestibular system, maybe you can provide us with some practical strategies that we can use to circumvent the damage, inevitable damage that occurs when we don't pay attention to the movement in our life, which is probably the majority of people watching this.
I think one of the errors or oversights in the field has been the emphasis on total hours sat instead of what I call uninterrupted hours sat. In other words, if you interrupt sitting reasonably frequently, you're less likely, or maybe not at all, the experiment has not been done, to show the effects of prolonged sitting. Now, within half an hour.
What can you expand on the effects? I mean, by effects, what do you mean?
The documentation on the effects has been extensive in the last 5 years, and it's continuing all the time, because a lot of meta-analysis studies, which I take with a pinch of salt sometimes, but have been done that implicate absolutely everything, not only the cardiovascular system and heart disease, but the incidence of stroke, cancers, especially, interestingly, colorectal cancer, GI cancer, ovarian, and prostate cancers. I feel there is a circulation component in that with sitting, an occlusion aspect that contributes and makes things worse all around. Diabetes and obesity have been shown to be correlated as consequences to sitting. Depression.
Okay, so loads of diseases.
Loads of diseases, and significantly more and more work, especially in children, in reduction in cognitive reactions.
So we know one of the benefits of exercising, independent of sitting, is increase in BDNF and also PGC1 alpha, which is an obscure metabolic pathway responsible for increasing mitochondrial reproduction. So do you think, and that's what exercise, but most people wouldn't consider standing up from sitting exercise. Is it your belief that you still get the same metabolic benefits? It would seem like it, because what else would explain the decreases in the reductions of the diseases you just cited?
I don't know. All I know is that within 30 minutes of sitting, triglycerides are increased. That is a very significant response. If you're driving for an hour, half an hour to get to your doctor, and you're sitting in the reception room another half hour before they draw blood, of course you're going to be diagnosed as a pre-diabetic. We have to be a little more critical about how we do things in real life, and before jumping to all kinds of conclusions. The intermittent standing signal is just that. It's a signal. It's a tuning mechanism. 12 calories burned per stand. And it's spread out throughout the day. Terribly important. Terribly important.
But it's not a calorie burning benefit at all. The calorie reduction or calorie loss is pretty much insignificant. That's
right. It's about 12 calories. Not exactly your diet.
And that's standing how frequently throughout the day? 16 times a day, or?
Well, if you stand, for sitting, I would recommend something in the 32 to 36 times. I'll tell you why. I did an experiment. The last experiments I did was in bed with bed rest, lying in bed continuously. And the question I asked, because we were not having a lot of success with completely preventing the changes with exercise, horizontal exercise in bed. I thought, well, I wonder how many times you have to stand up, or how many times a day would you have to exercise if you spread it out and you're upright, to prevent the effects of lying in bed continuously. I used standing up as a control. My experiment was on exercise on a treadmill for 15 minutes every 2 hours or every 4 hours throughout the day. When I got the results in, and this was a double-blind study with had a fancy statistician, and he called me in and he said, "Joan, you're not going to like these results." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, the standing was more effective than the exercise, than the treadmill, in preventing the changes."
Now, is this, let me, for clarification, is this standing up continuously or standing from the being recumbent in a bed?
Standing from being recumbent in bed, and standing for 15 minutes, okay? Because that's what I knew at the time. I took a guess. And it was amazing that that was enough. Standing up every 2 hours was enough.
For 15 minutes.
For 15 minutes each time.
Okay.
During a 16-hour period, daytime period. Awake period, if you will. And I thought, obviously, that my next experiment would have been less time, more frequently, less frequently, more factors. But I went to Washington, became a bureaucrat. So the experiment was never done.
Mm-hmm.
However, the data that I have been seeing coming out suggests that from standing up about every 20 to 30 minutes it is a good counteraction. I'll tell you why in a second.
But when you stand up, is it still standing up stand up every 15 or 20 minutes and stand up, or just stand up once and then go down?
I was convinced that it was still going to take less than 15 minutes standing up. My next experiment was going to be 5 minutes. I saw, for instance, Professor Eric Pepper at San Francisco State University has his students stand up at 30 minutes during a lecture and wave their arms around and sit again. Mm-hmm. And he reported that that was sufficient to keep their mental acuity up. There are little tidbits of information here and there that somewhere in the 30-minute time frame. I did an experiment all on my own. One time after I left NASA, I wrote a book, the G Connection, about the role of gravity. And I got an award for it. I was coming back from the platform, and I saw this man waving his arm, saying, "So what's your book all about?" I said, "How you can stay young as long as you live." I was being flip. I wanted to get away. He says, "Yes, how?" I said, "Well, stand up every 30 minutes. And then I realized he was in a wheelchair. And so I made a quick exit and returned to my table, and a colleague at the table said, "Did you know who that was?" I said, "No." He said, "It was George Mueller." George Mueller was Mr. Apollo, a rather testy gentleman that you didn't cross often. And I thought, oh, well, here's the end of a nice relationship. 3 months later, he calls me up and says, "You won't believe this. We went to the Muellers, and George answered the door upright and proceeded to offer drinks." And we asked his wife what happened, and she said, "Oh, he did it all himself." What did he do? He stood up every 30 minutes. Okay, that's an N of 1. I proceeded to do 6 people. Recommended older people, one 99-year-old, one 92-year-old, one 57-year-old, one 87-year-old, that I met along the way and were willing to do it. They all gained a good degree of independence. Is it the answer for longevity or whatever? I don't know, but whatever it was, it helped them with their
No,
independence.
that is vital. That's a really important point, and I just want to emphasize that because, I can appreciate it as my parents. My mom just passed away a few weeks ago, and my dad's probably maybe not too far behind. And I'm absolutely confident that one of the major contributions was their inability to move. And they had some reasons for it, but this inability to stand up is I know once you lose that, you are rapidly accelerating your progress towards death. There's just no way around it. And this is such a simple strategy. Here you had a handicapped person in a wheelchair, and that's one of the questions after too is what can you recommend for people who are in wheelchairs? And it's something as simple as standing up. But obviously, not everyone's going to be able to do that. They are paralyzed. Obviously, Mueller had some capacity, he just was using it.
Yes,
but most people aren't paralyzed. They can stand up.
Yeah, well, not only that, but there is a stand-up chair, a stand-up wheelchair that props you up on demand. It's
nice.
It's a wonderful device. Absolutely.
So would you still get the same benefits because you're changing posture, but you're not exercising your leg muscles?
That's correct.
But wow, I did not realize it was a stand-up wheelchair. I had no idea.
Yeah, well, I know it's in Michigan. They have devised it, and it's a superb device. I've tried it myself, and it's very easy very light, very easy to use as long as your arms are functional. And you can go shopping in a supermarket and look at things at eye level. You can talk to other people at eye level. It is a very, very important addition to the disabled.
Yeah.
Who cannot stand up.
Or elderly, or elderly.
And or elderly, absolutely. Yeah. And or elderly. The elderly is a very interesting thing. I gave a talk recently, and someone said they'd read a paper, a survey had been done about what is the most significant factor that makes families move their parents to a nursing facility. And the top most important factor was being unable to use the toilet, which, you can imagine is a very simple motion of sitting down and standing up with some independence. And it is so fundamental to the well-being, to the sense of well-being, and well, independence is a very, as you said, is a very crucial.
Yeah, and once you lose that, it's been my observation that you're not going to be around here a lot longer. I mean, you can, but there's the anomaly. So.
Well, like unfortunately, nursing facilities, good as they might be, are a one-way street.
Right. Yeah. There's some good ones out there that really pay attention to exercise and get people moving, and and they do a great service. But
absolutely. But there's a lot more that can be done.
Yeah.
Both social interaction, touching, the sense of touch is extremely important to elderly people who just don't get touched as much.
Yeah, so that's a really good one. So thanks for addressing the disabled one. The stand-up wheelchair is a golden pearl. So in your book, you outline another strategy, and I'd like you to offer a few more, perhaps, is having a pet. Just having a pet will increase. There was just a study done yesterday that shows it increases your steps by 2,700 steps a day. An additional 23 minutes every day of moderate physical activity, which is not insignificant. And I think pets are great too, because they don't live as long as we do, and they force, when they pass, they force us to learn how to deal with grief, which is a profoundly disturbing emotion. But learning how to address that is going to be useful in the future.
Yeah, that is a wonderful aid to keeping us independent. Because someone else depends on us. Something else depends on us. Terribly important. The going up and down stairs, we've lost the art. We have facilities that help us get up and down and that sort of thing. So it is crucial to be able to retain that independence.
Yeah, and you can just look for opportunities. You know, I travel, and you know, let's see, a lot of people in airports. I'm sure a lot of people travel too, and there's always options. You can take the escalator, or you can take the stairs. You can take the walkway, or you can walk.
Yes, and I saw this wonderful railroad station in Paris. It was a station where people went to charge their electronic devices, and they charged them by riding a bicycle. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. It was full of people. There they were, charging their electronic devices. An asset in both ways. But let me tell you another one about exercise, and that we don't sometimes ask the right question. I was giving a talk, and this other colleague was giving a talk, and she came up to me afterwards and said, you know, exercising throughout the day is very important. I said, yes, thank you. She said, you know, I have been trying to walk 10,000 steps a day. I have one of these fancy Apple devices, and that tell me when I've done it. And because I can't go and walk 10,000 steps in one walk or one run, I spread it throughout the day. And what I found, because of my device, was that when I spread the walking, my 10,000 steps throughout the day, I lost 750 calories. I used up 750 calories more from the same number of steps.
And that's most, well, I would actually, I don't know why that would show that, but I can understand how it would metabolically work, because you're changing position.
Yes. Yes.
But that fitness tracker shouldn't have indicated a different calorie.
Well, this Apple device shows also the calories. So she was checking also the calories that she had burnt that day, but she never put the two and two together. She was looking at doing her 10,000.
Yeah, so it goes exactly what your theory is. You know, you can't out-exercise inactivity. You just can't. You have to do it low for, it doesn't have to be a lot, just simple standing up. How much simpler does it get? Now, it could be expensive if you have to get a stand-up wheelchair, but you know, what's the alternative?
They're very distressed because Medicare has not been able to cover them, but most people who get them see tremendous benefit.
Yeah, it's just really a major pearl. Now, one of the other points getting back to the astronauts that you mentioned in your STEM Talk interview, which I thought was intriguing. I hadn't known about it before, because in our last interview, I wasn't really interested in ketogenic diet or burning fat for fuel and just eating healthy. Now I've written a book on it, and you know, it's a very thorough, comprehensive treatise and review of the molecular biological literature.
Excellent.
And you had mentioned the ketogenic diet was one strategy you had recommended for the astronauts. I'm wondering why, because you didn't expand on it in your previous interview.
Well, we want them to survive and not lose muscle and bone and maintain their brain and the rest of the physiology normally. I mean, after all, bears do it during their hibernation, and they use up their fat as fuel, and they don't lose muscle, they don't lose bone, and interesting enough, not really relevant, but they also they're pregnant, they have their young while they're hibernating. So the point was to recommend a ketogenic diet to preserve the physiology while providing an alternate fuel to glucose. Certainly, using glucose as the fuel, you do lose muscle and you do lose bone.
Yeah.
And we do know that the brain certainly is a lot sharper and functions more cohesively.
Yeah. The little tweak that I found, actually, I've applied it personally, was that it really needs to be done in cycles. So you can go straight ketogenic, but if you do that for a long term, you're going to really cause more harm than good, I think. So
it's like everything else.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a square wave. You know, you don't do one thing forever. You
Right.
have to change. The body is there to alternate, to change, to get signals, to stay alert.
Sure. Which reinforces your central thesis, which is that you need to move continuously and change your position. You should not be static unless you're sleeping.
That's right. Exactly. Even during sleep, we have cycles.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah. But you're not moving very much.
No, sure. I hope not.
Now, what are you doing now? Are you in retirement or?
Oh, I've been retired for 17 years.
Okay, so what have you been focusing on other than writing books? And if you had any other epiphanies, because as I mentioned previously, when you were at NASA, you know, you're so time crunched, you didn't really have time to go on the side and think about these things. But now you do, and I'm wondering what conclusions you've reached.
Well, we have already a colleague in France has already done a 10-day fast just to see whether ordinary people that we would recruit as volunteers would have any trouble fasting for 10 days. And the answer came back, not at all. They said,
if ordinary people, most ordinary people are overweight, so they probably would benefit from it. But if you had a really thin person, you know, I'd be careful.
Oh, yes. I mean, these were all under supervision, and obviously they were fasting, but drinking and having their tea and the coffee or whatever, a bit, all the things they would be allowed.
I've interviewed Dr. Jason Fung, who's a nephrologist in Toronto. Yes. You know, he really wrote the book on fasting, and it's just a magnificent tool. I just was taking care of a patient with heart disease. It was pretty much terminal, but the first thing I did for him is put him on a fast, and you know, put him on an ECP machine, extracordial pulsation, and like his whole life changed in a week. It was amazing.
But, you know, this is very interesting. It's where we started. And I said to you, I never had breakfast growing up.
Sure.
And not only that, I'm amused that the books that have been written about the Mediterranean diet and longevity and all that, and they don't ask a simple question, what do you eat for breakfast? No cereal is eaten for breakfast. I mean, they don't even think about eating bread for breakfast. They'll have their coffee and they'll go about their business.
Well, let's go into your history a little bit, because obviously anyone would recognize you have an accent, and you're Greeks. You're ancestrally you're Greek, but you were born in Egypt because your father was a physician and was trained there, and then you wound up getting trained in London as a pharmacology.
Yeah, I was an undergraduate in pharmacy and went to London and got a PhD in pharmacology at the University of London.
Yeah. So you've had an interesting experience, and got married and came to the United States, which really
yes. But you know, not eating breakfast. You know, people have said to me, "Oh, Joan, you must eat breakfast. Breakfast is the big meal, is the main meal of the day. How can you live without eating breakfast?" I said, "You know, I've grown up this way. It doesn't bother me." So when I was reading all Fung's and Asprey's and whatever in your book, I thought to myself, I'm fasting anyway.
Yeah.
From the time I eat my dinner, which is early anyway, to the time I get around to having a meal, which is lunchtime, I'm fasting it anyway. I should start looking at this.
Yeah.
And I have. And I added the MCT oil. And
caprylic acid is even better.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm.
Okay,
that's
good.
what I'm using. Your favorite brand.
All right, well, good.
And in fact, I started wondering whether the oil without the diet might be an effective tool.
It has some of benefits, there's no question, but it's not as good as if you're actually burning fat for fuel yourself. And for people who are metabolically compromised, you know, relatively severe Alzheimer's, cancer, you can take ketone esters, which are far more effective than the MCT oil. But you know, I wouldn't recommend it for a healthy person.
No, I was wondering whether for people who want to get started on an obesity reduction program, whether
Fasting, if it's obesity, there are simpler ways. I mean, you don't have to do the fat for fuel approach. You could just fast. I mean, that's going to be the quickest way to get you to burning fat for fuel. And, the intermittent fast, I think, is profound. I used to do for 12 or 14 to 16 hours, but I recently bumped it up. I'm doing 18 to 20 hour fasts now. So I'll just eat for 4 hours in a day.
I do about 15 to 18,
Yeah, and I think it's even better. And I started doing it. I thought I should be eating when I exercised, my strength training stuff. But then I realized I was probably blunting the anabolic stimulus. So I'm doing it fasting now, and I still work out as hard, and I think I get a better benefit from doing it. So,
but you don't need to lose weight.
I'm sorry?
You don't need to lose weight.
No. I have to be careful. When I travel, if I travel for a week, I invariably come back losing 5 pounds. It's like, oh, darn.
The other way around, isn't it? Yeah. Now, that's fascinating. It's, I can't help but ask questions like the survivors of the Holocaust.
Oh, yes.
Lived a very, very long life.
Yes, indeed.
Which is interesting. And I wondered whether a period at a critical time of being on a ketogenic diet, which they jolly well were for that period of time, fixes somehow. Here I'm just throwing out ideas.
No,
right?
When you, and it's not just concentration survivors, concentration camp survivors, but actually whole countries, and they looked at this really carefully. Usually in war circumstances, when there isn't a lot of food available and people have less calories and they're essentially forced into ketogenic state, they survive longer. They live 5-10 years longer than than if they had just normal happy times and were feasting all the time. So,
but after that period, though, they've gone to our bad ways of junk food and whatever else we consume, which is interesting because whatever that bolt did, whether that jolt, that period of ketogenic period, had a lasting effect on their longevity.
Yeah. So I'm glad you picked up on that and are applying it yourself personally. It's a good thing. I have one question for you about combating some of the osteoporosis and the sarcopenia. In space, I suspect you're familiar with the power plate. It's promoted as being developed by the Russians space program for their cosmonauts. And I think when they were doing it up in space, I don't know, but it would seem like if you're strapped in, that pulsing up and down might serve a valuable benefit. And I'm wondering what your research has shown. Yes,
you've seen Clinton Rubin's work also. He has a plate of...
No, I haven't. I have not.
A fellow called Judex, I think, is probably the engineer who developed it. And he's done several work with a variety of animals. And they did try vibration in... subjects in bed rest, but I don't think they did it right. Quite frankly, I don't think they did it right. Again, I think you'd have to expose them
continuously,
or intermittent periods.
Regularly, most of the day, 16 hours.
Regularly.
So that's the key.
With breaks, with variation, maybe a slight variation, the frequency, just to keep them alert and their system and the receptors, the proper receptors, alive.
But do you think that, I mean, it's a relatively small movement, it's like 2 or 3 millimeters, but it's still generating significant force. And I'm wondering, so if it applied with the principles you just suggested, that it might be beneficial.
It should be applied by something that straps it to the bottom of their feet.
Right. They've got to be secure, otherwise you're not going to get the benefit.
No, get that sort of thing. I am sure that it's that type of device that's going to be the solution.
Ah, interesting. Does anyone at NASA listening to you now?
No.
Well, there are private alternatives now. Maybe we can get you in touch with Elon Musk, because I think SpaceX is going to get to Mars well before NASA does.
Oh, absolutely. I have great hopes for the SpaceX group, and there are other groups as well, Bezos, who would be just want to make sure they keep their paying customers healthy.
Mhm.
because the last thing they want to do is have complaints.
Sure. Well, keep people healthy. So do you have any speculations as how you could best mitigate against the ionizing radiation? Is there some type of shielding you can use, or a molecular remediation that you might be able to implement?
There is shielding that polyethylene, oddly enough, which is a very simple polymer.
Really?
Yeah, is one of the best shields.
For gamma rays?
And water. Now, water is heavy and it's
Yeah.
hard and it's cumbersome.
But you could have the storage tanks around the vehicle.
Oh, you can certainly have storage tanks around the vehicle, and you can have a safe haven,
Right.
also, that is surrounded by water, and somehow, protect that way. But polyethylenes, or some sort of plastic, if you will, even a two-layered with water in between, a compromise of the two, should be an advantage.
How thick does the polyethylene have to be?
I don't know. Not very thick.
Interesting. Because this is something that should be used on airplanes. I mean, people don't realize it. When you're flying at 35,000 feet, take a Geiger counter up there. I've done this. You are getting 20 times more radiation exposure. If they're concerned about Fukushima, well, you should be a lot more concerned about flying up at altitude.
And going over the polar route.
Is that even worse?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Pilots who fly regularly on a polar route, I mean, I have no idea what happens to them.
Well, it would seem that it would be reasonable. I didn't realize polyethylene can block it. That seems kind of odd. You think it would be something like lead, but I mean, little piece of plastic.
Lead does, but there are material scientists around kids, young people who would love to have a challenge like the X Prize. Put a prize out there and let them think. It would come back with all kinds of suggestions. This is the sort of thing that we should be doing, not trying to find it by the same old way.
Yeah. So you think there's a possibility you might have to be able to have some input into SpaceX?
I think SpaceX is going to be a lot more receptive. Though their medical guy, no, that's the wrong one. No, I don't know who the medical guy for SpaceX is. I know for Brannan, but he's not there yet. But he should be receptive. He should be receptive. I've been trying to kind of gently, but of course, the guy's so busy with.
Well, I would imagine it wouldn't be him directly. It would be someone in his team. Yeah, that would you connect with. You certainly have the credentials, well-established credentials, to be a benefit there.
You never know.
No, because they're real serious issues, and thankfully, you learned a lot when you're there, and you did the work, and you basically summarized it and gave us practical implications of what we can do on Earth, which is going to affect a lot more people than the astronauts.
Yeah. Oh, let me tell you the other thing that I didn't tell you. I'm just holding you up. When I said that astronauts exercise 2 to 4 hours a day, and then they do nothing. And why are we surprised that it's not as effective as we would like? There have been exceptions. There have been exceptions. First, Shannon Lucid, who was menopausal when she went up on the Mir for 179 days, exercised throughout the day on the treadmill. Secondly, this will interest you. The Russians, the food they give their cosmonauts is sardines. I knew I'd get you.
Yeah, that heart disease patient, I only had him eating one food. He wasn't totally fit, and I had him on sardines because he had no omega-3s. Yeah. That is great. I had no idea.
Well, they have...
That's like the perfect food for astronauts.
I went to Russia in the 70s, and all they had was canned fishy stuff, including caviar, which none of
That's
my
another
colleagues
great source of
liked it.
omega
I
3.
loved it, but
Yeah.
it's wonderful stuff. But one of our astronauts, a medical doctor, who went up with the Russians, lost 17 pounds in his mission because he wouldn't eat the Russian food. Okay. Well, the Russians have always said they don't have such a problem with keeping their cosmonauts healthy. Well, maybe it's their diet that they've had all along and nobody paid any attention, and we turn our nose up at it.
Yeah.
These are silly little things that you get to observe or to think about when you're sitting around retired or semi-retired.
Yeah, and most likely, it would seem that it's a real challenge to change that, because it's the conventional wisdom and medical viewpoints on the whole process, and you're not going to disrupt that because you're some oddball Ph.D. who has these ideas. You're not a doctor. You're not a medical doctor.
It's a seismic event that will change it. Unfortunately, that's the way we are.
Yeah.
So
yeah, but it doesn't change the reality. I did not realize that the cosmonauts had a more advanced way of thinking on that. That's interesting.
Well, I think they just I don't think they did it with ketogenic diet purpose. I think they did it because that's what they had.
Yeah. Well, it works.
It worked. They've probably gone down the hill since they've been eating American food.
Oh yeah. I would imagine that would be the normal consequences, precisely what you would predict. All right, so this has been great. It's so good to reconnect with you again and see that you're still doing well. And anything up in the future, any big plans coming up?
Oh, I'm out there flogging and talking. And, one of the interesting things I saw in the space program, I was hired because of my stress research.
Oh, that's right. That was in your original position. That's why they hired you.
Yeah. And so I think I'll go back to that. And I thought I've sort of almost done it, but I want to restructure it and do it in a different way, more personal way. A book called Stress Beyond 50.
Ah, great. Beautiful
Because
thing.
there's more of us around.
Yeah, I just interviewed Dr. Dale Bredesen, who is,
Yes.
are you familiar with his work?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, because he was interviewed on STEM Talks too, and great work that he's doing. He's just a pioneer. He comes out with a new book in September on how to end Alzheimer's, which is an epidemic. So he got some great strategies in there that really align with what we're teaching. So powerful stuff.
Absolutely, it's possible. I mean,
Oh, he's convinced, and he's probably one of the leading experts in the world on Alzheimer's. So
yeah.
There's no reason to disagree with him.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for everything you've done. Really appreciate it. You keep up the great work. It's always good talking to you.
Thank you. And your book is fantastic.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
Very much.